We are back. You are chatting with John P. Today, we are going to be talking about how I purchase and decide on which watches go in my collection. Mostly, I'm going to be focusing on kind of how I make the decision. And even previously, before I had Rey Watch here, where we buy and sell and trade watches, new and pre-owned. I was collecting for such a long time, more than a decade. Really, I was collecting watches since I was about 18 years old, and I've learned just so many things because I have to admit I was obsessed. I mean, I still am to this day, but I spent so much time as the internet kind of matured and developed with all these tools, really figuring out kind of how I can fit that into at least my watch collecting journey. So I want to share with you some tips and tricks about how I decide which watches go into my collection. But first, on the wrist is a watch that I've recently added to my collection, is a Rolex 1016 Frogfoot dial. I mentioned this in a previous video, and no one really seemed to even comment on it, even though it's, in terms of vintage watches, it's quite desirable. So I was surprised. I don't know, guys. Are there any vintage watch collectors out there? Let me know in the comments below, because I can also talk about vintage watches a little bit more in the future, which is something I started with and, maybe have kind of gotten away from just in terms of, what we have here at Rey Watch to actually show and share with you. So let me know, comments below. So first, while I'm a dealer and things come in the door, that's kind of how I decide today, right? So today, when things come in the door, things get kind of pushed across the desk or are offered to us from other dealers, that is generally how I'm adding things to my collection, just because, I'm just so busy and I kind of get to scratch my itch for watches here, always getting to try and see what's going on and trying new watches and maybe watches I've missed in the past because we get so many in through the door. And so typically a watch pops up that I really enjoy and put it on my wrist and I really love it, and that's when I add it to my collection. That was actually not the case with this particular Rolex Vintage Explorer 1016. Actually, I picked this up for my friend Eric at Win Vintage because he surprisingly, I tell him, I'm kind of interested in maybe adding another vintage Rolex, and we don't get too much vintage here, at Rey, but I really like vintage. So he literally pulls out a tray of vintage Rolex Explorers, and I was like, okay, now there must be something here for me, and there was. So it's kind of the same kind of thing, being able to try all of them on at once, but that's not how it always was for me, and most people do not have that luxury, especially with watch dealers and watch stores going online. So the first thing I have to say, at least with me, is I learned very early on that if I didn't like it at least 50%, there would be nothing that would get me to like it anymore. If you see a watch, you should be able to get, in my opinion, up to liking it 50%, because, you can wear it and that 50% can turn into 100%, but it's not likely that you might only like the design, and that's 25%. And I know I'm just using percentages here just so we can come up with some kind of concept and kind of conceptualize this here to translate to you through the internet. But if you don't like at least the watch a little bit, is what I'm saying, there's almost no chance, at least in my experience, that you're going to like it a lot and keep that watch in your collection, and you'll just have to get rid of that watch later, and that comes with other considerations, as I'm sure we can all think of. So at least make sure you like the watch 50%, because it's probably not going to grow on you more than 50% to make up for that and get it to stay in your collection. So something that I would always do as well is I'd pull out my watch box, wherever you're storing your watches out there, I'd lay them down. Now, this is going to be difficult if you're just starting your watch collecting journey, which is great because it's a clean slate, but the same underlying concept would work for you as well. Lay the watches down and really see what you have. There's sometimes people might have 4 or 5 watches or more, and they forget they have a watch. Or some people, they have a tray full of dive watches, and then they realize, well, I'm not wearing this one, I'm not wearing that one. Well, think about this. And that's something that I've done in the past is, why am I not wearing this? Is this particular watch too heavy? Should I avoid watches of this weight? Is it something with the color? Is it something with the clasp? And unless, you really set these things down and look and figure out why you're not wearing it, it doesn't really make sense to add another watch to your collection that might also have those particular those same features or functions, or it might share some similarities in a certain way, and then you also will not wear that watch. And I see it a lot. I see people, they say they like dive watches, and it might just be that one particular reference or model, and then they collect a bunch of other dive watches, and it doesn't work the same for them. They say, oh well, I like the Rolex Datejust, so all time date watches on a bracelet I must really love, and it doesn't turn out to be the case. It certainly was not the case for myself, and I think that's a really great rule to kind of go by. Lay it out, see what you're missing, and maybe, if you don't have a chronograph, consider a chronograph. Maybe if you don't have a dive watch, consider a dive watch. But it's really rare to see someone that is comfortable and they actually are happy with like an entire dive watch collection, an entire chronograph collection, nothing else. Something I've noticed, something for myself, so I, of course, want to share that with you. Next, I don't care too much about the resale value. Now, let me explain. Of course, no one wants to take a loss on anything, right? And if you can avoid that, why not? That is good. Who has a problem with that? But at the same time, if you follow kind of the other guidelines and you don't buy something that you like, or at least you could see yourself really liking and you kind of like it right now, then of course you'll have to sell it, in which case you'll take a loss. But if you never plan on selling the watch, you'll never take a loss. And with that comes buying the watches right. So here's what I do, and here's what I've done in the past, and it's always worked. Before I was a watch dealer, I never really took a loss on a watch because I either kept it a long time, or if I just wasn't, in love with it for whatever reason, or, some reasoning behind that, and I didn't follow one of my rules that now I know, over a decade later, I never really took a loss. In fact, I'd usually do pretty well just because, as the dollar becomes worth less, things like watches, these newly kind of asset class type, really luxury goods, but it seems to be tied to where the dollar's worth less. The watches kind of go up in price as well, even if it's just a little bit, just to keep up with inflation. And so what I would do is I would go to Chrono24 and I would get a feel. Let's say you've decided that you want a particular watch model. Go to Chrono24. Before you pull the trigger, go to Chrono24. See what the watch prices are listed at. Now, keep in mind, it doesn't mean that the watches are actually selling at that price. There could have been a watch that sold the day before for much less, or even much more if the condition was better or it had box and papers, which do add some value. So keep in mind when you're looking at that, but look for what is listed at. Go to the eBay, go to Rey Watch, for example, which we tend to be some of the more competitive pricing. Go to the other websites, go to Chrono Caliber, go to Watchbox, go everywhere and see kind of what the variance in pricing looks like, and also take note of the condition, because when I add a watch to my collection, I really avoid at all costs, if I can, a watch that's not in great condition. Not even considering that you might have to polish it, and a lot of people are hesitant, especially talking about vintage watches, Rolex watches, with polishing. If a watch is in really bad condition, even if you can polish the scratches out, I'm talking very bad condition. A little bit of wear and tear, some wear and tear is okay, because I wear my watches, I don't mind. I'm going to wear them very heavy personally, just to share that with you. I only buy watches that I'm going to wear, so I don't care too much. But if you start seeing some serious dents in the cases, sure, you can fill it in. You can have a professional case, worker, a case worker. No, like a polisher, they can fill this in with stainless steel or gold, depending, using laser welding and some other methods. But it might mean that something else is going on inside of the watch with the movement. Now, probably not. Just if you just had to guess, what are the odds, right? These are pieces of metal. They're generally really good at withstanding shock, but it's a little bit more than not having that dent to lead in that direction. So I just avoid it because I just don't like trouble. It might be a really great deal, but I don't like trouble. And when you spend money, you might say, oh, well, I could always just have it fixed. Just having that watch, sitting at a watchmaker. Watchmakers are at all-time demands right now. There's a shortage of really great classic watchmakers, and those that are available are generally working for the brands, or they're retired, which is, why we have Hans that works with us, because he had a really great career and he works with us, kind of in a semi-retirement, so it works out. But that's super rare. Watchmakers are in demand. For you to buy a watch and, as a fixer-upper and send it to a watchmaker for, it might be on their bench or in their safe for 6 weeks because there's such a waiting list for watch repair, or send it to the brand and they tell you you need a new case because they won't let the watch come out. Not a great thing. I've done that before in the past. We avoid it even here at Rey Watch. It's just something that bogs you down. You say, I won't mind it, but always 10 times out of 10, everyone that I see that gets a fixer-upper or it needs a hands replacement, something like that. So I always avoid the watches in that condition. And something else that always delivered a better value, if there was a particular watch that I thought, I really wanted a great deal on, I would buy the watch without box and papers. So I know many people say, whoa, I need the box and papers because of the resale value. But once again, if you plan on wearing the watch and you don't buy a watch just because maybe it's hot or it's whatever kind of green dial du jour or blue dial du jour comes out that year, and you plan on wearing the watch and you like it more than that 50%, the resale value shouldn't matter a whole lot. Now, of course, if you do have to sell the watch for whatever reason, something comes up, or, who knows, anything could happen in the world. Maybe you're moving. Doesn't matter the scenario. Yes, the box and the papers are going to help a little bit because it does give some people the comfortability, and people are willing to pay a little bit more for a watch that has box and papers, especially when we talk about Rolex, because more people that don't know the subtleties of the watches really rely on that kind of paperwork and documentation to prove authenticity. It does help, but in my experience, when I wear watches, I really don't care about that, because all my personal watches that have the box and the papers, I can't even tell you necessarily where they are. It's different for Rey Watch because we have a business and we want to make sure everything is fully proceduralized. But my personal collection, the box and the papers, I honestly don't know where I have them. They're in desk drawers or at home. They're in sock drawers. I don't even know because I wear my watches and I like them. In fact, I'll share with you, there's on our website right now, Rey Watch, there's a watch of Vincent Calabrese Transworld, which I thought was amazing. It has a super cool complication. It has a second time zone, and the date is actually tied to the second time zone. I just thought it was interesting. It's from an independent watchmaker. Very cool story behind Vincent Calabrese, and I thought I would love the watch. Fancy lugs, really beautiful watch, hammer texture dial, something like you would see out of Grand Seiko, though this came out, maybe 18 to 20 years ago, and I really enjoyed it. But it didn't fit that rule, and I'm selling it right now just because it just sits around. And that's something that I always, I break a rule myself. And as I thought about it making this video, I need to share this because even I fall into this trap sometimes when something cool comes up or it's a really great deal. So trust me, everyone falls into this. I also like to suggest, now if you buy a watch from a reputable dealer, you know who they are, the well-known reputable dealers, you don't necessarily have to worry about service because they go through watchmakers and service centers and they have inspections. But if you buy a watch out on the forums, you buy a watch on eBay, it doesn't matter that there's an authentication program. They're not timekeeping this for you. And also Chrono24 from a private party. It just something I always like to keep in the back of my mind, even if we buy watches for the business, is a watch may need a service. And when you start getting into certain price points, this makes a big difference. I mean, even at the high end of the spectrum and the low end of the spectrum, because let's say you buy a $1,000 watch, well, service price, let's say it's some type of chronograph, $350 minimum, and that's if you have an independent watchmaker. And so you start increasing the price of the watch, and that's something to keep in mind is the service price as well. You consider in the next 5 years, you're going to need a service. For some people, that's a big deal. For others, it's just the cost of owning the watches, but it's something I like to share because genuinely, some people are surprised that, 5 years after buying the watch, it needs a service, but that is super normal and something that I always consider when buying a watch, especially a watch that's complicated. If you buy a perpetual calendar, you have to factor in that it's going to need a $1,200, maybe $1,200 service sometime in the future. And when their watches are more complicated and more parts, there's a greater chance something can go wrong sooner just because of the complexity and the scale of adding additional functions of the watch. And two last things I want to share. And this next one is I'm a real stickler about adding these watches to my collection because I do like to keep watches and wear them. Is I avoid watches that have weird bracelets or straps. Let me explain. some watches have these proprietary straps. I mean, you could say the Richard Milles and the Audemars Piguets of the world are perfect examples, but there are many, many countless others, and there's not a lot of aftermarket alternatives. I avoid these watches personally because if you want to change up the strap or the strap just wears out, especially talking about leather, or if you want to keep that watch long term, you really get in a pinch trying to find a strap or a bracelet that's going to fit perfectly, and then what is available, you're just kind of stuck left paying out on the market what the price is. Not all the brands will stock straps and bracelets and these kind of accessories forever. And so if you keep a watch 20 years or you buy a watch that's 20, 30, even 40 years old, if you want to start talking about vintage, you have to hunt for straps and bracelets. I have an IWC Ingenieur 666, a vintage Ingenieur, and I was looking for a bracelet for it, and there was just not the right bracelet out there in the market. I'm still looking to this day for the bracelet. Now, it's a watch that can be worn on a strap, thankfully, but that's not always the case, especially if you talk about modern Ingenieurs. So I avoid this. Not a big deal for everyone, but if you keep your watches for a long time and you wear them heavy, this kind of becomes a hassle. So I do try to avoid it when possible. And lastly, I'm not trying to kind of perpetuate snobbery in the watch community, but something I've noticed for myself and others is brand name is just a factor sometimes. Now, there are some people out there, and even I can look past brand name a lot of the time if I really do love the design of the watch, but sometimes a brand might do something silly, and then you're just like, maybe I'm not wearing the watch. To give you an example, I'm really enjoying Breitling's new collections. I think they're pretty cool. I think they have some really great things they're doing, with the exception of increasing the new Chronomat watch to 44 millimeters instead of the 41 or 42, which is the same watch. So they made a bigger case size, I think they announced today. And so sometimes when brands start acting out of at least what I think is something that they should do, I just kind of lose that connection with the brand, and it no longer speaks to me personally. And this isn't something that's isolated for myself. There's other people the same. For those that are able to say, it doesn't matter, I don't care about the brand, that's great. But at least I notice a trend out there, including in the watches, including with myself, that people tend to buy products or use products that somehow they associate with. And you see it in marketing. It makes sense. If you can resonate with someone and get them to really believe in the brand, then the products come with it, and there's no really selling involved. And that's something that also, if I'm going to use a product or a brand or support something, I generally like to at least have some connection or at least nothing negative about the brand, right? Girard-Perregaux, I can't say that necessarily they're doing like great things as a brand out there and connections, though all of a sudden they partner up with Aston Martin. They don't have a new, and they've released Aston Martin watches in the past, by the way, but they put it on their homepage, and this happens to be a brand that I really do enjoy. So for me, it was a no-brainer, and now all of a sudden I'm thinking about a Girard-Perregaux again. So something I've noticed when I've added a watch to my collection that I didn't really have a connection somehow, I feel like the brand wasn't aimed for me, then I generally didn't keep those watches too long in my collection. But what about you guys? This is something I've been thinking about, the brand connection, the watch brand person connection. Do any of you out there think that some brands are really connecting with you very well? I would love to hear why in the comments below. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time. You've been chatting with John P. Ciao.